we're all a bit out of breath from the weekend's activities, and I want to just publicly thank Director Stowe and all of our Human Rights Commission and the Black Rock Center and all the partners for a wonderful, wonderful Juneteenth celebration. That was our county celebration this weekend. I don't know if you counted how many. I'll let you speak to that, but it was the first time we really, since the federal holiday was granted, and since it was the second Juneteenth here in Montgomery County that we've actually officially recognized as a holiday. But I think it was by far the largest gathering that we've ever had for this relatively new to some, old to others, holiday. And just as a reminder, because education is important, Juneteenth is the day that we celebrate here in this country, Freedom Day for African Americans who were formerly enslaved when in Texas, almost 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln, just a few miles rather from here. The final enslaved African Americans in Texas got word from General Granger after a deception, lying for several years, that they were indeed legally free. I think it's important to note that this was a celebratory day, but it's also a day to remember that freedom, justice has often been delayed for many in our country. And along that route is denied for many in this country. I often think about Maryland and here in Rockville, where we were one of the last states to free enslaved Black Americans. In November 1864, just a few months before Congress in January 1865 would pass the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, Maryland, by referendum, about 30,000 votes to 29,000 votes, barely by the hair of its chinny chin chin, passed a referendum to free enslaved Black people in the state of Maryland. Absentee ballots, we're a couple days from Election Day in DC, a couple weeks from here in Maryland. Absentee ballots had to be counted from Union soldiers that had sent them in order to secure a ending of slavery here in Maryland. I think it's important to note that history as we celebrate Juneteenth, because it's a reminder that we have to continually secure freedom and progress, generation after generation. But all that being said, we had a great time this weekend celebrating. Heard from one of the original go-go bands, Rare Essence. You couldn't get a spot on the lawn, and people just celebrated and got together, and we're just so excited to celebrate Juneteenth. I gave you some history, hopefully, that you didn't know, and maybe some that you did. But I want to just thank our county. I want to thank County Executive Elrich. I want to thank my colleagues that we had stepped up and started recognizing Juneteenth as a holiday even before the federal government did so. So it's really an example of how we continue to push forward and lead. And so I want to turn it over briefly to Director Stowe to give comments, and then we'll read the proclamation celebrating Juneteenth.
When Israel was in Egypt land, the call was, let my people go. They were so oppressed that they could not stand. The call was, let my people go. And so finally, at least partially, they did let our people go. But as you've heard, just partially. In the pronunciation of and proclamation of the Emancipation Proclamation, there's one piece that people often don't think about and don't actually read. Because there's a section within that proclamation that would suggest then that persons who were now the newly freed persons were in fact not to collect themselves at the military. They were not to be idle. And in fact, if they were to be idled, they indeed then could risk being arrested. And thereby then, for their punishment, being sent then to plantations to work out that punishment. And so the cycle continues. And in fact, it was not until December the 6th of 1865, the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and then in 1868, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, and of course the 13th Amendment ending slavery, and the 14th Amendment, of course, giving due process, equal protection under the law. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment, giving us the right to vote. And even then, the struggle continues. Just yesterday, a state in this United States voted from the standpoint of a platform to repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And so the struggle continues. You know, some of the slaves were stunned, Councilmember Jawando, when they heard the news. Some of them were in disbelief. Some of them said, what do we do now? What do we do next? And there were others who were leery of the untruthfulness of what they heard. And so the journey continues. And so, my friends, on this day, we do celebrate, because our theme for this year's Juneteenth was to memorialize the struggle, to celebrate the successes, and to move forward with securing the justice and equality for all of us. And so, yes, we must never, ever forget the struggle. It happened, folks. It is real. It's real. Regardless of what people tell you, it is real. We have had successes, absolutely. We've been able then to move beyond the point that many of us could ever even imagine. Some of them have been significant and historical. So we celebrate those successes. And we must ensure that every resident of this county, every citizen of this county, every citizen indeed of this United States of America is guaranteed due process, equal rights, all the privileges afforded each of us. And that, my friends, must not ever be negotiable. So there then is the celebration of Juneteenth. That's why we celebrate. That's why it's significant. And it will be my hope and fondest desire that all of us, regardless of your race or culture or station in life, enjoy this holiday and celebrate this holiday, because it's a human celebration of all of our humanity. And that, to me, makes it different. And so I would hope then that next year the numbers are so overflowing that we don't have room to, in fact, to encapsulate them. I would hope that be the case. But more important, wherever you are in Montgomery County, that you realize that it is the Montgomery County way that we celebrate each other. We can do this in Montgomery County. Don't know about any place else, but we can do this in Montgomery County. So, my friends, as the new day begun, let us march on. Let us march on until victory is won. Happy, happy Juneteenth.
Amen. I was hoping you were going to sing.
I was ready.
I could see it was close. Come on, and let's read the proclamation here and celebrate Juneteenth. This is a county council proclamation from all of us. Whereas Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States, and whereas the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln legally freed enslaved individuals in 1863, but many slaveholders in Texas continue to hold on to their slaves captive for 2.5 years after the announcement, and whereas General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, and announced the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery. At that time, there were still 250,000 enslaved people in Texas. That day became known as Juneteenth, a symbolic date representing African American freedom, and whereas slavery set the foundation for hundreds of years of systemic racism, financial inequity, and health disparities for African Americans in the United States, while Juneteenth was a day of victory, primarily for those who were enslaved in Texas, it also amplified the injustices that kept those who technically had been free for 2.5 years from actually being free. And whereas Miss Opal Lee, an activist who at the age of 89 walked from her home in Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C. to call on lawmakers to make June 19th a national holiday. Named the grandmother of Juneteenth, Miss Lee eventually delivered 1.5 million signatures to Congress and achieved victory when the legislation passed in 2021. It was then signed by President Biden, establishing Juneteenth as a federal holiday. And whereas Juneteenth is even more important today, as African Americans across this country continue to fight to end racism and everything associated with it. If we really want to continue to break the bonds of racism, every American, as Director Stowe said, regardless of race, needs to understand and celebrate Juneteenth. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland hereby recognizes and celebrates Juneteenth, and be it further resolved that the County Council calls for all Montgomery County residents to do the same this year and all years to come. Presented on the 21st day of June on this year, 2022, signed by myself and the Council President on behalf of all of our colleagues. So happy Juneteenth, everybody.